And so the example I was talking about was Leo Frobenius out with the pygmies who were getting ready to go out one morning and hunt, and they first draw a picture on the ground of an antelope, and they wait quietly in silence for the sun to rise and the first rays of the sun to hit the image. When it does, they throw the spear at the image, and it hits the antelope, the image of the antelope in the neck. The woman raises her arms, and the men go off and hunt, and they return later in the day with the slain antelope with the arrow in its neck exactly where it was in the picture. And so Gebser says this is a perfect image of the magical mentality in which you manipulate reality through magical effects. Everything that you do has a kind of sympathetic magical connection with events that happen. So everything in the world of the magical structure is interpenetrated. We have it interpenetrates with everything else. So we have this idea, whereas in the archaic we had the whole, now we have the part for the whole, pars pro toto. So each aspect of reality can be manipulated to create magically resonant effects. It's a spaceless and a timeless world for primitive man. Spaceless and timeless, and it's one-dimensional basically, and that's the example that he gives for the magical consciousness structure. And then he says some of the other modalities about it. One of the interesting features is that he notes that in the artwork that is associated with the magical consciousness structure, very often you find this motif of the mouth being effaced or missing. We think of the Australian Aboriginal artwork of the ancestral beings known as Wandjina. They're very often depicted in petroglyphs on rock art as big, staring, wide-eyed beings with no mouths. And this mouthless motif you can find all through the artwork of civilization. Gebser says wherever you find it, you have the magical consciousness structure, which emphasizes non-verbal modes of communication, such as telepathy, which he believes to be real, clairvoyance, dance, ritual, non-verbal forms of communication. There is a myth, though, that Gebser doesn't mention that says that the reason why the mouths are missing on the Wandjina figures is because in the dream time the Wandjina had mouths and they pronounced all the magical spells that brought everything into being. Once everything was created, the gods took their mouths away so that they couldn't create anymore, because the world was created perfect and it was finished and not in any further need of improvement, and therefore the mouths were no longer required to continue creating. So this is the mentality of societies in which ancestor worship remains very heavy. There is no further need or use for gadgets and creating new things. So Gebser doesn't mention that about the missing mouth in the artwork of the magical consciousness structure. The primary organ is the ear. The ear, this is an acoustic. We hear in a kind of acoustic 360-degree cavern. The ear is the primary thing, and so he's always listening to nature. We have the drums, the phenomena of the drums, and the bird calls, the bird song, listening. The magical structure is acoustically organized and oriented. And in terms of body parts, it's the viscera, especially the intestines, that are the emphasis. And we'll see as the consciousness structures evolve, these body parts shift and change. In the head, the magical emphasizes the ear, but when we move into the mythical, the mouth comes in. And then when we move into the mental consciousness structure, we have the eye coming in. Likewise, with regard to the body, from the magical beginnings, we have the intestines. In the mythical, consciousness moves up to the heart, and then in the rational, it moves up to the brain. So there's a gradual Kundalini-like movement up the spinal column and forward from the head, from the ears to the mouth to the eyes, as these consciousness structures evolve and develop and differentiate in complexity from 1 dimensions to 2 dimensions to 3, finally to 4 dimensions with the integral consciousness structure. So then he says that as soon as we begin to get the efficient mode, though, before I finish, the efficient mode, each of these structures has an efficient and a deficient mode, and the efficient mode of the magical consciousness structure is indeed magic, spell casting. But the deficient mode comes when this has exhausted itself into sorcery and black magic, and there's an immoderation in the use of magic. It becomes overused and overworked. That's the deficient mode of it. When we move in next here into the mythical consciousness structure, he doesn't give a date for it, but he says that as soon as we start to get a concern with seasonal festivals, and hence a concern with time, And indeed, this is what happens in the agrarian world when farmers come in, they're rooted to the soil, and they become particularly attuned to the cyclicity of the seasons. They have to be, because they have to plant at certain times of the year, harvest and reap at certain times of the year. You find all this preserved in Hesiod's Works and Days, where the farmer will plant, say, when the Pleiades rise. In Egypt, it was after the flooding of the Nile, with the rise of Sirius that always heralded the flooding of the Nile. So when we begin to get this concern with seasonal festivals, we're moving into the mythical, which is now concerned with time. The magical exists in this cavern-like closed universe in which space is undifferentiated and time is undifferentiated. Hence it's spaceless, timeless, and appears to present the world as this eternal thing that never changes. That changes now with the mythical, in which time begins to come in, only it's periodicity. It's the time of periods and cycles. It's polaristic. And so we begin to, now we shift from one dimension in the magical to two-dimensional in the mythical. It's polaristic. We begin to get the separation now of the soul, whereas in the magical we had an awareness of nature out there. With the mythical now we begin to have an awareness of the soul, and the soul begins to differentiate itself as a microcosm from the macro soul. And at the same time we get these grand myths of the separation of the world parents, in which we have the sky. In Egypt we have the sky goddess Nut and the earth god Geb. In Sumerian civilization we get On and Ki. The sky god there is On, is a male, Ki is the earth god, or the earth goddess, and so on. So we get this sense of the heavens beginning to separate now. And in a certain sense, we begin to get the individual beginning then to separate and divorce himself from nature. And you can see this in the artwork. He says if you look at the artwork of Minoan Crete, you can see that the individual is beginning to stand more and more as figure against the ground of nature. He's beginning to be cut out more and more clearly from the background of the natural environment. All the creepers and vines and incrustations that had been associated with the depiction of the individual in works of art and the magical, all of that begins to fade out, leaving the lone individual standing there with less and less nature clinging to him. So we're beginning to get the self differentiating itself in the mythical consciousness structure. And of course, as the word myth suggests, the mouth comes in now. Gebser says, and I think he's wrong about this, but he says that because there is no mouth, or no emphasis on the mouth in the magical structure, there are also no myths. He says that where there's no mouth, there can't be any myths. He's assuredly wrong about that. There are plenty of myths, as Joseph Campbell demonstrates in his work in the ancient world of the hunters of the Paleolithic and in the agrarian world of the Neolithic. The whole thing is built out of myth. But I think his point stands, nonetheless, that the magical mentality predominates. But he says that with the mythical, the word myth is etymologically related to the word mouth, and we begin to get depictions of the mouth in the artworks of Mesopotamia and Egypt at this time. The ancestor beings give way to the gods, and they're depicted with mouths, and now they're creative. We get the idea of the efficient mode of the mythical consciousness structure is envisioned myth, the visionary trance state in the pictures of myths. Myths are imagistic, whereas the predominant characteristic of the magical had been emotional, visceral, instinctive. Now it's imagistic. Images are inherently mythical, Gebser says, and we begin to get these huge imagistic cosmologies that begin to be worked out now. The deficient mode, he'll say, actually is oral utterances, the speaking of myths. I don't know why he thinks of that as deficient. I'm not sure about that. But nonetheless, the mouth comes in and it begins to articulate the myths. And he says there's a basic ambivalence about the word myth, since it's etymologically related not only to mouth, on the one hand, a spoken utterance, but also to mute, which means silent, and from which we get the derivation of the mysteries. In the ancient mysteries of the classical world, one is initiated into them and remains wordless about them. So we have this basic ambivalence built into the mythical consciousness structure that is capable of seeing and meaning things the opposite of something simultaneously. There isn't this sense of everything being spoken in terms of the rationalistic A and not B. The principle of exclusion does not apply here in the mythical consciousness structure. So the word myth means both a spoken utterance, but it also implies the remaining silent. So we have the muses, but we also have the mysteries involved in all this. So it's fundamentally ambivalent, and it's polaristic. Rather than unitary, as the cavern world of the magical is, it is now polaristic. Everything is thought in terms of these yin-yang complementarities by way of which the universe is structured. And so the geometric diagram changes from the point to the circle. We think of the world-bounding circle, Okeanos, who binds the world in a circle. We move up, of course, in the organs from the viscera to the heart. For the Greek, consciousness was centered in the chest, in the heart, not yet in the head. And we've moved from the ears to the mouth, and from the emotional to the imagistic. And that's the vision of the mythical consciousness structure that I suppose we can say comes in with the high civilizations. Again, he doesn't give dates here, but with the high civilizations beginning in the Bronze Age with the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, and surviving down to the time of the Greeks. He says that with the Greeks we begin to get a new mutation of consciousness, the rise of the mental consciousness structure, which begins to configure itself in its early phase about 500 BC. Later it'll be rediscovered in its late perspectival phase by us northerners around the time of the Renaissance, 1500 AD. That's perspectival. Everything up to 1500 AD, remember, is unperspectival. The magical is pre-perspectival. The mythical is unperspectival. It has a sense of time and periodicity, but not yet of space. Space is still undifferentiated. But when the mental consciousness begins to configure, he says, you can see it coming here. It begins to cast its shadow in the Iliad, in the sense that the wrath of Achilles, the first word of the Iliad, which is the first word in the West, is wrath, which is menon. And menon is etymologically related to the word mentality, measurement, mensuration, the moon, everything that has to do with thinking. And his wrath is not just blind rage, it's actually a directed wrath. It's very specific, very directed. His protector is Athena, and Athena is born from the goddess Metis, who is the goddess of wisdom. She springs from the head of Zeus after Zeus devours her because he's afraid of an offspring coming to end his rule. He devours her, and Hephaestus opens up his head with an axe, and out springs Athena, who is the patron of wisdom, and also of Odysseus. She is the protector of both Odysseus and Achilles, and she is the immediate child of Metis, the goddess of intelligence. So in the word mentality and menon, and in the beginnings of the appearance in India of Manu, we have Manu the lawgiver, who is primordial. In Crete we have King Minos. We begin to see this prefix appearing everywhere as the earliest beginnings of the manifestation of the mental consciousness structure, which now begins to discover space. It doesn't ever fully discover space, of course, until the Renaissance, when space is wide open and the old cavern world collapses. But the geometrical model shifts from the point to the circle to now the triangle. The triangle, you can think of the vertex in perspectival painting, but also in triadic forms of thinking such as thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis as the unified third. The Christian Trinity is a manifestation of this kind of Trinitarian thinking for him. And he says that it's significant that Christ is the first God who resists resubmersion back into the mythical, in the fact that, for example, he walks on water. He doesn't fall into it. Water was the old symbol of the soul in the mythical, and he resists the regression back into the magical and mythical consciousness structures. So Christianity takes place now within the world of this mental consciousness structure. Moses, too, is the lawgiver, who is a sort of hero of wrath, like Achilles, and he says lawgivers are always wrathful. They always have this directed anger. So both what Spengler had differentiated as the Magian and the classical are together here as part of the mental consciousness structure. The Greeks discover, as we all know, the rules of logic and rationalism. And so we begin to get the movement now to the eye as the primary organ, from the acoustic world of the ears in the mythical, in the mouth, in the magical rather, in the mouth in the mythical, and now we get the eye as the primary organ. And of course we see the geometry shifting, that the triangle really cuts the circle. The mythical mentality is a circle. If you think of the world-bounding serpent Okeanos, the triangle is a tool of logic and rationality that is going to be invented here that will, by the use of discursive reason, cut the binding circle, the old mandalas that held civilization together, kept the psyche together. And you can already see Sloterdijk's catastrophe on the way here.